Welcome to the Daily Word verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Hebrews. Keep in mind, I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. So if you're using a different translation, the read's different, but the message is the same. Also keep in mind that these Daily Word verse by verse studies are uploaded to my YouTube channel, BP The Bible Perspective. That's BP The Bible Perspective. So like and share these videos and subscribe to BP The Bible Perspective. Okay, we're in chapter 3. I'm going to pick it up verse 13. Now, he just warned them not to have an evil heart of unbelief, which what? Will cause them to depart from God. Now, what is interesting is this is not speaking to a person who is a Christian. The assumption that a person who is a member of a church or who has said the sinner's prayer, and they can even be an active member of the church, but mean that they have been born again and in the kingdom of God. That's not what he's saying. And the fact that they would depart, for example, we have people today who, even after decades of even pastoring the church, saying, hey, I'm an atheist now, right? Or they're backsliding, or they're just leaving the faith. Okay? Well, again, were they ever truly saved? What he is speaking to this crowd is that they're not. He's speaking to that crowd of people who you should have confessed Jesus. God has laid out the argument. You should have believed on him. Don't have an evil heart of unbelief. So verse 13 again, he says, but encourage, and I'm going to read 12 and I'll start picking up at verse 13. Watch out, brothers, so that there won't be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that departs from the living God. But, verse 13, encourage each other daily while it is still called today, so that none of you is hardened through sin's deception. Now remember, the hardness and the sin here is unbelief. The sin here is God is saying, this is my way, and then your sin is I'm rejecting that. So he's not talking about just you having a weakness in sin, which we all do, because then he would have to specify the sins. Or if he says every sin, no matter what, we would be in big trouble. And remember, the propitiation Jesus wrought for us is what protects us, rescues us from sin and the consequences of sin. This sin is unbelief. What he's referring to here is rejecting God's way altogether. So he says, encourage one another, each other daily while it's called today. Now, this term today, if you go back in verse 7, he says, today if you hear his voice. And the reason I want to bring this up because the term today it's talking about a period of time where God is speaking his grace. So, as a trivial, as a sidebar, people ask how come God is not addressing certain social issues or political issues or world foreign policy issues. Well, because what he is saying today is what you ought to be listening. Because notice he said, today, we say today if you hear his voice. What is he saying today? Don't harden your heart against that. So while it is called today, this day, and one day, this age, right, this period of time, today, which is the day of grace, is going to come to an end. If you follow the eschatology of it, then you go into Revelations or the end times or the tribulation period. Okay? Then verse 14 says, for we have become companions of the Messiah if we hold firmly unto the end of the reality that we had at the start. In other words, notice he says, he's looking at this from a start to finish. The proof that you are a believer is that you will hold firm to the end. if you do not hold firm to the end, means that you was never a true believer. Verse 15, as it is said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Now, the rebellion meaning that first generation. The first generation of Israelites that he talked about, remember here in verse 7 through 11. So then verse 16 says, for who heard and rebelled? So he asked this question. Wasn't it really all who came out of Egypt under Moses? Now he brings up Moses in because remember he makes the comparison that Jesus' ministry, Jesus' mission, is superior to Moses, right? So he says, well, who rebelled? That first generation. Moses was sent to that generation, the slavery, which is fascinating. If you go back and you read kind of the account of it, they had been in slavery now for 400 years. And it was a burden. They had that sense of national pride. But yet, when they got delivered, they didn't accept God's way. So he says, so who rebelled? He says, wasn't it all those that came out of Egypt? They complaining. That generation that came out, which people estimate to be somewhere around the neighborhood of anywhere from maybe 1.5 million people, could be even more. Okay, 1.5 million. Some even estimated kind of higher. That came out. That all of but that entire generation died in the wilderness over the next 40-year period because they rebelled. Verse 17, and who was he provoked with for 40 years? Were not those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And who did he swear that they would not enter his rest, if not those who disobeyed? So we see that they were unable to enter because of their unbelief. This is important. One, notice he says disobey. What did they disobey? The first generation, they were a trip. For the first 3 months, they complained to God. And that's the story goes. The 40-year period is broken down like this. They delivered from Egypt, and then the first 3 months they complained, till you had the golden calf incident, and that was a big sin. And then you had the erecting of the tabernacle. When you get into the second year, and then God says you're going to go to the promised land, they refused to go. That's the sin. But they refused to go because they didn't believe that they could possess the land. They rebelled against God. So they disobeyed. Now, it's important to understand when we talk about salvation, because this is what the analogy is, that the only reason why people go to hell, like the only reason why that they did not go into the promised land, wasn't because of even their idolatrous ways. It wasn't even because they kept sitting and complaining. God had mercy on them for that. They finally just refused to believe. The only reason why people go to hell is because they refuse to believe. And so notice in verse 19, so we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. That's why. The reason why people cannot enter into heaven. The reason why people cannot enter into a relationship with God is because, now notice this, they refuse to believe. And it's not even that they can't believe, it's that they refuse to believe. And one sidebar note, too, that I want to say that is kind of interesting to my Calvinist friends. Notice here he says that they were unable to enter because of unbelief, not because God didn't choose them. Okay. But back to the... But again, he's laying out his case, again, to those who should receive the gospel. This is where he's going with this. those who should receive the gospel. Why aren't they receiving the gospel? He said, just like, and remember, he's talking to the Jewish people, that just like that first generation did not enter the promised land because of their unbelief, he says, don't fall short of heaven because of your unbelief, not embracing the gospel, not embracing the Son of God. All right, chapter 5 in the next video. I will see you then.